what does poverty take from people, and what is the impact?
I think the impact of poverty is much more profound and troublesome than people imagine. We see the outside. People are hungry.
Yes.
Their stomach growls. They need some food. But the impact of poverty over the long run is total. It affects individuals, of course, and it affects the whole communities in which they live. I was involved with a school where there were many poor children who didn't have breakfast even before they got to school. And many of them had had so many difficult issues, such as moving all the time, not having a computer at home. I mean, just little things like that, that are never taken into account very much, even by educational authorities, the people who make decisions about how well a student is doing, but not taking into account the impact of poverty on their lives.
You know, when I think about poverty and how it affects others and what it robs us of and from, I often think of the baptismal covenant, you know, where we invite those who would follow Christ to respect and care after the dignity of all of humanity.
Absolutely.
Because what poverty robs first and foremost is dignity. The idea that one would be placed in a position where you have to decide whether you're going to eat or pay rent, whether you're going to purchase medication or school supplies. And there are so many ways that manifests itself, and it becomes very insidious. It gives rise to all sorts of health problems. It gives rise to deterioration of community as people become increasingly more transient, looking for a less or a more affordable place to live.
Sure.
It affects schools and communities in ways that don't always seem obvious, and it changes the foundation of what it means to be community in places. When we think about poverty, I often think about those that I've encountered through the ministry of LCS who are working full-time, and that full-time wage is not sufficient to provide for them and for their family. Or I think about someone who became ill, and the expense of catching up with that illness overwhelmed the family budget and took away whatever savings there were.
Absolutely.
And so poverty manifests itself not simply in homelessness or abject hunger, but in homes like you described earlier, where someone comes to school without regularly having had breakfast.
Sure.
Or, you know, those who depend on school lunches go home and there's nothing for the weekend.
We're just living from paycheck to paycheck, and then suddenly there isn't a paycheck.
Right.
And there are people who've never known poverty, who are suddenly finding themselves in a situation that's almost unmanageable and need support of one kind or another. For me, addressing poverty is not an extracurricular activity. It's a part of the gospel. It's a part of what we're called to be and do, is to enable people to experience the fullness of their life. I think our call is to walk with them. It's a ministry with them. That's what I think. I think it's really walking with people.
The word that you are provoking in me is accompaniment.
Yes.
Accompanying our neighbor in their need, accompanying our neighbor in their lack and their want, but also recognizing that in caring after our neighbor, in loving our neighbor, God does something in us and through us. And that in our caring, in our sharing, in our giving, we're receiving. We're receiving the gift of that partnership and accompaniment. It's not just an us versus them kind of dichotomy. It's not about money. It's about relationship. And it's a relationship that's founded in listening and understanding the need of the neighbor. I've had a chance to tour 2 of the feeding ministry sites, and the 2 things that struck me in those tours, one was at the LCS headquarters, the other at St. Stephen's Church in Trolley Square. In both of those cases, I was overwhelmed by how the volunteers work so hard to make sure people were receiving the gifts that they would actually use and that would be satisfying and dignity restoring. You know, especially at the headquarters, that client choice kind of feeding ministry set up where you can go in and do a little bit of shopping. Right. But in giving people choices and speaking to people and getting into some sort of relationship and knowing who's in the household and what they like and how it is that we can actually get nutrition and help to them and with them builds a relationship that endures. The second thing that struck me from those two visits to those sites were that there was a very fluid boundary between volunteer and client. My experience at St. Stephen's was that food was coming in and the clients were actually expediting it to the volunteers who were getting it on the shelves so that the St. Stephen's folk, the volunteers at that site, could actually get it back out. And you could see there was community. There was partnership happening. At the LCS site, the day that I went to visit and had my tour with the director through the supermarket, I call it, down there on the lower level, two of the volunteers introduced themselves to me as former clients of that feeding ministry that they themselves had received, and they were paying it forward, and they confessed they didn't have much money, but in their age and in this season of their life, they had time, and they were giving it back. Not equal gifts, but an equal sacrifice.
That brings up the point of what can I do? What can I offer as a person who is not poor but wants to be helpful to those who are?
And I think that's something that we need to be challenged by again, because many of us are not in poverty. And many of us have everything that we need and much of what we want. But our giving, our commitment, our hearts, the extension of our hearts to our neighbor does often make the difference between whether or not someone eats that day or whether or not someone has secure housing for that season or whether or not a kid has the tools and the gifts that they need to succeed in school and to break out of this cycle that overwhelms again and again. And it's not about the size of the gift. It's not about how much or how little. It's about the sacrifice. To recognize that in giving up something of ourselves, we're giving someone the possibility of a different life. And it's not a handout. It's a hand up.
It's a hand up.
And it's often paid forward.
But if we really all saw ourselves as members of the same community, you know, the human community,
Yes.
then there's something that we have to share. There's something we have to receive.
And isn't that what Jesus talks about?
Yes.
You know, when did I see you, Lord? Naked, hungry, in need of shelter, imprisoned, sick. When did I see that? And it doesn't take very hard a look to see that happening
It doesn't.
all around us in the world today. And it doesn't manifest itself in ways that we can expect or anticipate. And yet poverty happens. And poverty gives all of us an opportunity to recognize the God that we pray to is right here among us and needs our hands and our hearts. And that our wallets are just as much a part of our baptismal identity
Absolutely.
as the church that we belong to or the commitments that we have to serving with the people of God. And so I feel encouraged, you know, by the work of LCS and the work that we share, because we are building what Dr. King called beloved community. Not where it's us and them, but us together for the sake of this world.
One of the things that I'm concerned about, and you are too, we all are, I think, is the tendency to normalize poverty. It's so much a part of us
Yes.
that it's normal, and it's not normal.
That's right.
I mean, to me, that's just so important for us to recognize that it's not normal to be downtrodden, to be poor, to be without. It's not normal to not have a decent place to live and education and the opportunity to grow and to be all that you were meant to be, to bear witness to the gifts that God has given you. It's not normal to see all of that squashed.
Yeah, and isn't that what we do when we work together through ministries like LCS? We meet the normative experience of poverty, which is generally one crisis after another, and we meet that with the possibility of education to break out of that cycle, prevention to get away from some of the habits and the hurts and the hang-ups that perpetuate poverty, and then to provide the resources, the dependable resources for how one meets poverty so that one can find empowerment toward having freedom to live and work and learn, not wondering where the next meal is coming from, or whether or not we're going to have electric, or if it gets cold, will there be heat? Or is this going to be our home, our school, our community for a time or a season? And so that idea that working together, we can provide more than just the answer to the crisis. We can provide empowerment to break that cycle, that normative cycle of poverty that we've become so accustomed to. It does something. It rebuilds the very fabric of society. It mends what it means to be community. And it changes not only lives, but the lives of many.
It changes everybody's life. It does. I mean, when poverty is truly addressed, then for many, many reasons, those who are not poor can also be at peace. Everybody is at peace when everybody is at peace.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And I know that sounds pie in the sky, but I know that for me, that's got to be where we're headed.
Yes.
Where all of us live and move and have our being, with freedom, with love, with justice, with hope, and that we feel and know in our own selves that we are empowered to live our lives, to make decisions, and so on.
And to have the agency to be able to make those decisions for ourselves.
That's the word.
To have the choices that so many of us take for granted that our neighbors don't have. To give people the opportunity to claim their healing and their wholeness, and to know that we're not only a part of that, but in our sharing, in our caring, in our giving, we're also claiming our own healing and wholeness.
Absolutely.
And that we are building something larger than ourselves and something that we are certainly called to as people of faith, but also as citizens. Citizens of this community, citizens of this state, citizens of this world. And to have a vision that's larger than just putting out the fire, but having a sense that we can do something toward preventing the fire in the first place. Or when the crisis comes, to be able to respond in a timely way without having to reinvent the wheel. LCS gives us a vehicle. It's one of the tools in the toolbox that helps us to do something great for God and our neighbor, and in so doing, allows us to do something great for our community and for our own health and well-being as well.
Couldn't have said it better.